All right, in this section now we're going to move on and talk about why philosophy is important. And I think philosophy is in fact very important. I'm going to tell you why. But to start off, I want to begin with a quote from a well-known philosopher from the 20th century, Mortimer Adler. And he writes this: "Philosophy is everybody's business. Not everybody is called to be a doctor, engineer, or whatever, but everybody has to have a view on philosophical topics. As men, as thinking individuals, as soon as we reflect upon these things, we are doing philosophy." So he's emphasizing there the importance of philosophy for everybody. And let's get into our topic of discussion, the importance of just philosophical topics themselves. The same philosopher, Mortimer Adler, he asked us to sort of conduct this mental experiment, okay? Just in your mind for a second, just imagine, first of all, the list of important topics that philosophy talks about. And I have some examples here for you. Things like, what is justice? What is right and wrong? What are human rights and where do they come from? What is happiness? Is it attainable? What is knowledge? How do we know things? What do we really know? What is evidence? What qualifies as, say, a good argument? What is the best form of government? Where does everything come from? What is the purpose of life? Do we have a soul or are we just a body? And these are just some examples of important topics that philosophy talks about. Now imagine, Dr. Adler says, if there were no philosophy, imagine if just the world was just void of any philosophical thought or discussion at all. Nobody ever even thought about these topics that I just mentioned. Imagine a world where no one even asked philosophical questions like these. Wouldn't it seem like something's wrong? Wouldn't it seem like something big and important is missing from that world? And I think clearly it does seem that way, because these are questions of utmost importance. Right? Things don't get any more important than this. Okay? So if there were no philosophy, all these questions would go unanswered. In fact, you wouldn't even be raising these questions, because once you raise these questions, you are doing philosophy, you see. So wouldn't you agree that in this little mental experiment that something very important was missing? And what it would be missing is philosophical thought. Okay? So I think this exercise shows us how important philosophy is. Now, of course, this exercise doesn't give us all the answers to those questions, but I think it does justify the effort, you see. All right. And I think just kind of moreover, it's kind of obvious that it's important to know what the great minds throughout history have said about these questions. You know what I'm saying? We need to know the history of intellectual achievements, the history of the intellectual achievements of the great thinkers regarding these ultimate questions, so that we can think more critically about them in our own worldview. All right, so I think this exercise helps us to see the importance of philosophy in a general way. But we can move on now and kind of say, more particularly how philosophy is important and why it's important. And it is important, I think, in different ways for different reasons. Number one, philosophy is important for individuals, just you at an individual level. And the reason why is because philosophy just enriches your life. It does. It makes it more enjoyable. The study of philosophy, and I can attest to this from personal experience, will give you this sort of lifelong source of joy, a lifelong source of just intellectual enrichment. Okay, it's a unique sort of joy that you can go on to enjoy later on in your later years. When you're young, you like to play basketball or football or sports. You can't really do that forever, not for very long. But philosophy, this activity of the mind, this intellectual life, you can go on and do this in your later years as well. And it is, like I said, a source of intellectual joy. We can philosophize at an individual level just for the good of our own minds, our own mental enrichment. And there is a certain sense there's a certain sense that you get pleasure from this. There's an intellectual pleasure that you get from contemplating and thinking about these important things. Just a pleasure from just knowing things, okay? Aristotle talked about just as human beings, we are natural born knowers. Man desires to know by nature. We just want to know things. And he uses the example of the eye. Just like we like to use our eyes to do things. I want to go drive a car and use my eyes, or I want to write a book or whatever. So we want to use our eyes for practical actions. But that's not the only reason why we want to use our eyes, right? We just want to see stuff just for the sake of seeing. Well, in the same way, human beings just want to know stuff, not that they're going to go out and do anything with that knowledge, but just knowing for the sake of knowing. The pure intellectual pleasure and enrichment that comes from just knowing things. And I think this joy that comes from knowing things is its own justification for doing philosophy. So you can think about it in terms of philosophy and why it's important for individuals. You can think about it in terms really of just human perfection. As human beings, we are rational, we like to reason, we're, like I said, natural born knowers, and we perfect that ability when we exercise it well and become trained in important things and academic thought in this regard. So again, just like I said before, philosophy, covers some of the most important and fundamental questions of life. I just gave you a list of them a while ago. Things like what is right and wrong, what can we know, what is the purpose of life. These are very important questions, okay? So just at the individual level, there's a certain pleasure and human perfection that comes from contemplating these things and coming to some answers. And I would add, just kind of as a final note in this regard, really, as Mortimer Adler said at the beginning of this video here, philosophy is just unavoidable. You can't help it. You can't help but have ideas about philosophical topics. It's unavoidable. Okay, so you can think of it this way: human beings by nature, just because we want to know these things, we naturally ask these questions, and we have to live in a way that gives some sort of semblance of an answer to these questions, right? You can't get out of doing philosophy. So everybody has to have views on these important questions in life. Everybody has to philosophize, okay? The only question is will you do that well or not, you see? As Aristotle, the Greek philosopher Aristotle once said, you say one must philosophize, then you must philosophize. You say one should not philosophize, then to prove your conclusion, you must philosophize. Either way, in any case, you must philosophize. A second reason why philosophy is important is because it's important for society. Good philosophy, I think, can help society come to important conclusions on certain topics, like, for example, things like justice, rights, law, and so on. You see, you think about how many debates there are today on different topics, you know what I mean? Different topics regarding human rights and things like this. I have a right to an abortion, but most people have no idea what these terms mean. We have debates about right and wrong and good and evil, but can they really define those concepts well? I don't think so. You see what I mean? So these debates, again, are unavoidable. They're important, but can you do it well? Can you talk about these things intelligently? Things like rights, and where do rights come from, for example? Are these rights inalienable, or can they be taken away? There are important questions. These debates we have and the concepts we use in these debates are just pregnant with philosophical terms and elaborations and distinctions, and you simply cannot discuss these topics well if you don't have any philosophical training. That's just the way it goes. It's impossible to even think intelligently about these things if you don't know what you're talking about. And the study of philosophy helps you know what you're talking about in this regard, okay? So I think studying philosophy can help us reach important areas, reach conclusions in important areas of moral and, say, political debates by engaging in these kinds of questions. Things like, what is justice? What is the best form of government? What is the perfection of human nature? Things like this. These are very important topics that philosophy can help us with, and that's why philosophy is important for society too. The next reason why philosophy is important is because philosophy is important for science, okay? You can't even do science without having a whole ton of philosophical presuppositions. This is another example of where just philosophy is unavoidable, okay? So think about things like, what is the best explanation, right? A question like that. Now, science is full of giving us explanations. That's what science does. But what is the best explanation? That itself is a philosophical question. What is a good argument? Say a good inductive argument. Another philosophical question that's important for science. Or this question, what is science? Okay, what is science and what are the limits of science? You see, these are important questions presupposed by science, but they are in fact philosophical questions, and they really serve as the foundation of science. So any good science is going to have philosophical presuppositions at its foundation. So like I said in an earlier lecture, philosophy is not science. Okay, these are different academic activities, but still you can't do science without presupposing philosophy. And I'm going to delve a lot more into this topic later, the relationship between philosophy and science, because our current age is so enamored with science to the detriment of other things. I'm going to talk about that later on. Now let me finally talk about the last reason why philosophy is important, and that is philosophy is important for theology. Okay? From a theological perspective, philosophy is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, as the classic phrase said, philosophia est ancilla theologiae, okay? Philosophy is the handmaid of theology. So theology uses philosophy like a tool or like an instrument in a number of ways. For example, philosophy proves the truths that serve as the foundation for the faith. This is what St. Thomas Aquinas called the preambles to the faith, showing that God exists, for example. Apologetics, philosophy is very important here. Philosophy can also help us with the mysteries of theology and help them to be better understood by the use of analogies, good analogies, okay? And then philosophy can also be used to refute the adversaries of the faith. So in that sense, philosophy is very important for theology. And secondly, the second reason why philosophy is important for theology is because bad philosophy is a huge obstacle to the salvation of someone's soul. That's just the way it is. One of the greatest obstacles today to accepting the gospel message is because someone has bad philosophical positions. Okay, the philosophy is just this huge obstacle that keeps them from accepting the faith. You see, so as C.S. Lewis once put it, these false ideas about the world keep people from saving their soul. He says this, quote, "If all the world were Christian, it might not matter if all the world were uneducated. But as it is, a cultural life will exist outside the church, whether it exists inside or not. To be ignorant and simple now, not to be able to meet the enemies on their own ground, would be to throw down our weapons and to betray our uneducated brethren who have, under God, no defense but us against the intellectual attacks of the heathen." Good philosophy, he says, must exist, if for no other reason, because bad philosophy needs to be answered.